Great pleasure to invite Dr. Morne Mostert, who is the director of the Institute for Futures Research at the University of Stellenbosch, to address us in the keynote on leadership for the knowledge age and sustainable development, breaking with business as usual when planning for the future.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you so much for this invitation to this really exciting multinational, international event. It's fantastic to be here. So I'm going to share just a few thoughts with you on this enormously exciting thing that Jesse's doing, and where some of that might go, and what some of the, particularly the cognitive, the intellectual techniques might be that we may apply to extend that into the future. Have any of you been invited to sessions where you do future planning? What I find really curious is what other kind of planning is there? So if this is the future planning version, what are the other kinds? Why I'm asking that silly question is, to our mind, there's really only one kind, and that's for the future. In other words, the only place we could possibly go is the future. There is nowhere else. This seems to elude many senior people who make decisions based on the past. So let's examine what this might mean for the way that we think. Some of you are familiar with the idea of déjà vu, from the French, seen before. Déjà vu is the idea that you come across something, you just have a sense, I've seen this before. Fouché is a little idea, it's apparently trivial but quite profound idea developed by a stand-up comedian and adopted by the banking community in London. And it's the idea that you come across something and you know that you've seen it before, but you're looking at it as if it is the very first time that you see it. And what that does is it opens the world for innovation. So we've all seen Africa before. But what if we look at this as if it is in fact the first time we see it? What I find absolutely fascinating is how people from outside Africa think differently about Africa. Friedman called it think like an immigrant. In Buddhism it's known as the beginner's mind. You're coming at the idea as if this is the very first time you've seen it. So if we think about the flow of knowledge and the sustainability of our continent and the role that we as privileged people who work in this innovation and knowledge space can play in the future of Africa, what if we looked at it as if it is in fact the first time that we've seen it? Because our view as futurists is that those who know where they come from also know their past. Some of you may know that expression differently. Some of you may have heard it said that those who know where they come from know where they're going. Our view is those who know where they come from know where they've been. Because if it were true that those who know where they come from know where they're going, it must surely mean that the best futurists in the world are in fact historians. And there's almost no evidence to support that. So, our view as futurists is that in fact time will not tell. We cannot afford for time to tell. We find it really difficult to get people to talk about the future. Normally people speak about the future and then they tell us where we've been, and then they say, where will we go? Who knows? Only the future knows. Time will tell. Well, you're the leader. You need to tell, or at least ask, or at least get people together to decide. So in our view, we must tell time. So what is it that we're telling time? In other words, this future time, this time yet to come. Well, Jesse is doing this astonishing thing, acting as this catalyst on the continent to do this amazing work. And in a way, it's creating this fluidity for knowledge, which is the perfect environment in which knowledge flourishes. Not in policy, in fluidity. Policy is not the plan. Policy is just the framework. So are we telling time the plan? Of course, as some of you know, it's a legal requirement for futurists to use the word paradigm at least once in a presentation. Why is that so important? Because paradigms shape the way that we think, and the way that we think shapes the way that we make decisions. And when you're a leader, you're making decisions about resources. So your paradigm as a leader will influence the way that you decide about resources, and that will have an impact for decades to come. And if you base that on the past and not the future, then you're really basing it on a place where you're never going to go again. One of those paradigms where there was an enormous shift around the world in the sort of mid to late 1980s is the shift from categorization, classification, segmentation, taxonomy, trying to put things and people into boxes, to a systemic approach. In other words, trying to find the connections between the boxes, rather than to classify people or events inside those boxes. And here is a good example. The World Economic Forum, by the way, says that one of the key requirements in the next few decades for senior leaders is going to be curiosity. Some of you might recognize that picture as the Mars rover, known as Curiosity. Why is curiosity so important? If you accept that things change all the time, you must be curious about what's coming, not just about where we've been. Now, this is a very sensitive debate. This is not about the diminishing of the past. It is only about the celebration of the future. And here's a good example. Some of you may recognize this guy. Maybe we've got the wrong demographic here, I don't know. This is a guy called Will.i.am. No, it still doesn't ring a bell. It's popular music, colleagues. You've heard of this? You're just reading academic journals. Will.i.am, he's from a crowd called the Black Eyed Peas. One of their famous compositions is entitled "Let's Get Retarded." Bit of a superfluous call in some of the classes I teach, I can tell you that. But why am I mentioning him? Because about 4 years ago, Will.i.am became the Global Director of Innovation at Intel. You know Intel, the thing you use every day, inside all your machines? This guy's the Global Director for Innovation. Now, 30 years ago, you wouldn't think there's any connection between popular music and high technology. You would classify those things differently, wouldn't you? You would say, this is high technology, that's popular music. But this is a very good example of how in the era that we're living in now, leading organizations are looking for connections, not classifications. And what Jesse does so elegantly in this program is to create connections, as they do today, between 16 countries, and Ireland, and Finland. So the search for connection is one of the very early steps, driven by curiosity for creating the kind of future that we need. But what if the paradigm of Africa and its own knowledge background? We know, of course, the tale of Africa, the land of the dictators, those who have long since extended their tenure. We know the tales of malaria and HIV and disease and poverty and hunger. But that's really a fraction of the tale of Africa. Because the story of Africa also includes the celebration of knowledge. And the Ge'ez scrolls in Ethiopia and Eritrea, the former Axum, is a very good example of this. It illustrates a time where, in fact, Axum was a link between trading systems of the Mediterranean and the Asiatic world. It shows the extent. I'm sorry if the microphone is losing here. Here we go. We're back live. No, we're not. Shall I just let that go? Is that okay? Should we talk like that? Okay. So Axum was this amazingly exciting place in Africa, a place where learned people would meet and record exciting ideas. But you might say, well, is that an exception? Not so. Some of you know of the Museum at Alexandria, the famous library, of course. Well, This was the place of Archimedes, colleagues, of Euclid, of Aristarchus. The first chief of that library, Aristophanes, measured the Earth's circumference to an accuracy within a few hundred miles. What I'm trying to share, colleagues, is that the fluidity of knowledge and the generation of new knowledge, one definition of innovation, is in fact something that Africa is intimately familiar with. It doesn't stop there. Consider, for example, St. Augustine of Hippo. Yes, he worked within a theological framework, but he generated many ideas that we use today on humans as rational beings possessing free will. He wrote widely on just war theory. Both of these things appear on CNN almost on a daily basis. He was an African. Some say that universities originated with Bologna. UNESCO differs. They say the world's oldest university is in fact the University of Al-Qarawin in Fez in Morocco, founded in 859 AD. If you think that was an exception, Al-Azhar University in Cairo happened about 80 years later. It would be another 100 years before Bologna would be created. It would unfortunately be another 800 years before Africa got its next university in Fora Bay College. Only 30 years after that, of course, you all know the story of the Berlin Conference, where literally a group of leaders of European countries came together and chopped up Africa as if it is its very own pizza. With utter disregard for the flow of indigenous knowledge, with no respect for the nature of the populace there. Of course, no consideration of the natural life around. About 40 years after that, the French commissioned a well-known artist of the time to imagine in 1901 what the world might look like in the year 2000. And I thought I'd select for you the education version of that. And as you can see, that's not that far away from what Elon Musk thinks might be happening soon, with the implant at the base of our skulls. So let's look at the Bible of modern economics, The Economist, and what has it said over the last few decades, or the last few years at least, of Africa. In May 2000, it features Africa as the hopeless continent. In December, a decade later, the narrative is completely different, and we hear that Africa is rising. In less than a year, Time magazine illustrates an utter lack of creativity, but at least uses an inspiring idea to describe Africa in the very same terms. In March 2030, The Economist says, we are an aspiring continent. We're heading somewhere, we're going somewhere, which I think is exciting. In April 2016, The Economist says, how about making Africa work? A bit more of a pragmatic call. And in the most recent version, in August 2016, Africa's fragile democracies. But that's the right problem to have, right? Debating democracy, as I noticed on Kenyan television this morning, that's the right problem to have. It's a much better quality of problem to have. So the story of Africa and the flow of knowledge and the celebration of knowledge and learning goes back not just centuries, but more than a millennium. And here we are in 2017, brought together by Jesse, in which we once again examine what is the nature of the sustainability and the future of knowledge for our continent. You might be interested to know that in the South African Constitution, academic freedom and freedom of scientific research is in fact protected in its constitution. And we think that this will be a very exciting example for countries of the future. I don't know, I haven't come across, I obviously haven't read all the constitutions of the world, but it would be very interesting to see where else in the world, in fact, academic freedom and freedom of scientific research is protected in the constitution of the country. I think, a tremendously exciting idea. Why is all this so important? Because otherwise we develop a mindset of Africa that I think means that we always feel we're kind of struggling against it, we're up against it. Mindset is a dangerous word, isn't it? It's like your mind has set, you know, like a jelly. Or like cement, that'd be even worse, right? So for knowledge to work, and particularly in Africa, we need a flow, an elegant flow, fluidity of knowledge. And that flow is facilitated by connection, that Jesse does so elegantly here in this process. Einstein helps us to move into that future by saying the true sign of intelligence is in fact not knowledge, or not only knowledge, but also imagination. He said the difficulty with knowledge is that somehow, you know, you may reach the limits of knowledge. But of course, with your imagination, there are in fact no limits. So colleagues, if I may challenge you, I would say, what is it that you are imagining for the future of knowledge in Africa? What is that imagination inviting you to consider? Or are you falling prey to the world of the spreadsheet, in which imagination goes to die? Einstein goes further to say your imagination is your preview of life's forthcoming attractions. So in other words, if you don't have imagination, according to Einstein, your forthcoming attractions are really quite limited. So what is that imagination for the future of knowledge in Africa? You can tell from his facial expression there, he's already lacking some imagination. This was after the whole E equals MC squared thing. He couldn't think of anything else. It struck him. One of the things, tongue-in-cheek, I love about Einstein is you can quote him on anything, right? Here's a very good example. Because no one's going to say, I was reading some Einstein last night and you misquoted him. So, one of the debates we often have about paradigms when it relates to Africa, and of course there are millions of opinions on this, but I recently presented a paper in Madrid at the OIE there, the global home of business. Maybe I should just declare that I mainly work in the business environment. I'll just declare that first. That seems to be a thing you have to declare in South Africa. If you come in through the borders, anything to declare? Yes, I'm a capitalist. Who works in academia. In other words, a capitalist with no capital. So one of the key things that struck the audience in Madrid was the idea that the future of work, which was what that was about, is really in developing economies driven by social dynamics as much as by everything else. And in Africa, that linkage, once again, between social dynamics and the technology, I think is a crucial factor to understanding the future of our society. So one of the paradigms suggests that if we compare the West and Africa, this is always a big debate. If we start off by saying that, you know, the West and Africa is not always the same, then within 30 seconds there'll be someone who goes, excuse me, aren't we all one humanity? Why must Africa always be some special case? And then we'll go to the next audience and we'll say, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As you all know, we are all one humanity. And then someone says, excuse me, are you saying we're the same? So Africa is simultaneously the same and different. And that's part of the excitement and, of course, part of the opportunity. So one of the paradigms in the West is that you have this multi-century tradition of rule of law, which gives shape to the economics, which shapes the politics, which gives rise to a certain kind of leadership. And you may argue with some robustness that to some degree that gives you a sense of order, at least the impression of order. What of Africa? Well, there are many ways to debate this. This is just one way. But in one sense, leaders emerge in Africa, it would appear. Leaders have individually enormous power relative to the rest of the population. Leaders, in fact, seem to be shaping politics. Politics then seems to drive economics. And then there seems to be a continuous discussion about the nature of the rule of law. And that makes us call for control rather than order. And this has very significant implications for the future of the continent. So let us start, perhaps, or let us just continue with a few tenets of futures, just very briefly. When we think about the future, of course we know that it cannot be predicted. That's me after a really bad Saturday night, as you can see. Of course it cannot be predicted, but that doesn't mean it cannot be imagined. That's not a defensible argument for basing all of our decisions on the past. We know that futures is characterized by exospection. In South Africa we had this advert in the 1980s of this well-known coffee creamer. And some of you remember what the tagline, the slogan was for that. There's this gentleman who's looking for the milk in the fridge. Can you remember that? And his wife, she's the consultant, she shouts from the bedroom, "It's not inside, it's on top." That's right. In other words, what Futures says is, it's not inside. Now, I know many of you have watched Oprah. Yeah, lovely lady. And, you know, she has this thing that it starts with you. Our view is, unfortunately, some bad news. It's probably not going to start with you. That doesn't mean you can't do anything. Don't look at me so accusingly. I just mean that if we want to study the future, we must study not just what is inside, but certainly also what is on top. That's the leadership. And what is all around it. That is the society, and of course our relationship with the rest of the world. Our relationship with Ireland and Finland, as we see some fantastic examples here. We know that as the future develops, it creates a spectrum of opportunities. In other words, it's not so that the future develops and then the past just drops away. Think about, let's use a practical example. Think about the bicycle. When we invented the bicycle, you know, you can imagine people having conferences about the end of walking. That's it. The species will not walk anymore now that we have a mode of propulsion. Then we discover the motorbike. We go, okay, well, that's the end of bicycles, isn't it? Then we discover the motor vehicle. We go, okay, well, that's the end of motorbikes. And yet motorbikes and cycles are now a bigger industry than they've ever been since they were discovered. So in other words, the future does not evolve into some, you know, little block breaks away here and you add it back at the top there. It creates a spectrum of possibilities. And that makes the future a very exciting place to visit. It creates a spectrum of opportunity. We know, of course, that the future is complex. I won't bother you with that. And we know that as the future evolves, it will be caused by many things. And it will, in turn, cause many other things. Why that is important is linked to the complexity idea. It's not just a linear process. It's not a little domino effect where you just tick the one over and then the rest will follow. Of course, the future is also governed by what you want. What you want. And we would say you might as well be honest about what you want, because it will influence the decisions you make. We can see in the debate in politics that what the leader wants and this is what the society wants are sometimes at odds. But one of the tremendously exciting things about the future is that it is subject to our collective decision making. In other words, we can decide together. We can decide together. And so if we miss the opportunity to decide together, then we allow others to create our future. Then we have the experience that the future happens to us. Whereas if we find opportunities to decide together, such as in a forum like this, then we happen to the future. We create the kind of future that we desire. Of course, we know that as we look at the future, it changes. Let's skip business for a second. What about the media? Well, the media we have in many countries in Africa have quite a free media. In South Africa, at least, you can say, you know, more or less what you want. But the media doesn't invent things. It's a useful watchdog, but that name is not wrong. It's a watchdog. It's a dog that just watches. It's not an inventor. What about NGOs, the NGO sector? Jesse may be an example. There are some of them who are deeply connected, like Jesse, and others who are just too modular, too focused. What about the clergy? Any clergy in the room? Yeah. It's part of my point, I suppose. What about constitutional institutions? Well, once again, they don't design things. You have to go to them and say, protect us, and then they might. But they don't invent things. So what about academia? Who's from a university? Just one, two. Must be more. Yes, thank you. It's okay. Some of my best friends are at universities. It's fine. You can admit to that. Universities are places of innovation, right? They're places of design, of creativity. And what about business? Well, of course I'm going to be biased towards business. I know it has its own terrible history, but at least business is interested in the future. It's always interested in where it's going. So we do think that some of the magic in Africa has to be in facilitating the relationship between academia and business in a more sophisticated way. The two have been at odds. If there's been any connection, it's been because academia has criticized business. That's not wrong. Of course, we need academic freedom. But academia also has the platform, the privilege of creating neutral spaces where business and government and labor and many other entities can come together to design the future. So, what is our role then in strategic futures? A few questions for you. I've got about 5 minutes or so. Is that okay? What if our own obsolescent habits have precipitated current trend breaks? In other words, what have we been doing all along, 12% a year, 12% a year, that has now led us to the point where, in fact, we can no longer do that? How do we discern the noise to signal ratio? There's a lot of noise, right? Everyone's working on an app. That's not necessarily all of it a signal, and that's part of the cognitive complexity, is to discern that noise to signal ratio. Are we spending time on this? Does our generation have, and do we in fact inspire futures projects? I think Jesse is a great example of a futures project. What are those others? And if they're not futures projects, then why do they even feature? How do we overcome the risk of acrasia? Acrasia is this idea that you know what's good for you, you just don't do it because you can't be bothered. Right? You know you have to go to the gym, you just don't go. No, you shouldn't smoke, but you smoke anyway. Okay, enough about my filthy habits. What are we learning from our skunk works through experimentation and rapid prototyping? Some of the most innovative companies in the world, if we want to use them as an example, develop so-called sandpits outside themselves where they play. They play, they invent things, and then they bring it into the main business and they learn from that while the others play on something new. Where are we playing? How are we inventing those? What are we learning from it? Of what are we the nimble and agile harbinger? That is the shining light of things to come. What are we showing the world? This is what's coming. Follow this. Where are we? In fact, the vanguard or bellwether across sectors. And that is, what I mean by that is, where are we signaling? What are we signaling, and where are we signaling that to future generations? Perhaps we're doing it to each other. And what should we be designing then as evidence of our leading anticipatory competence? In other words, if we believe that we are anticipatory leaders, in other words, we're sensing where this is going, we're creating part of where this is going, what are we designing, or in fact should we be designing? We have, as many commentators have observed, in a certain sense, a flood of information and a poverty of knowledge. There's so much out there. One silly example is a recent Stanford study that suggested more than 70% of change projects fail. Is this because of a lack of change management textbooks? It seems that somehow knowledge, the kind of work we claim to be doing here, extends beyond information and beyond even the technology that somehow houses that information. And it extends to knowledge. And it is our work as the facilitators of that process to ensure that that also leads to wisdom, a kind of automatic competence. So, colleagues, in the last 2 minutes, just as money is the currency in the general economy, knowledge is the currency in the knowledge economy. And therefore the flow of knowledge must be optimally facilitated in policy, in power structures, and in infrastructure. Of course, part of that infrastructure is in technology. I'm going to thank you and encourage you to have a Vujade. It's been lovely. Thank you.